Welcome back to Sophisticated Discussions. This time, immediately post-trim. Today's episode is on Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish. Now, I think I'm just going to put out up front this time. The next book will be Foucault's Volume 1 of History of Sexuality. However, that book will be delayed because I am way behind on my 12 days of anime preparation, and that's a serious problem that I have to fix before I can really get back to focusing on non-school related readings. I'll still also be finishing the other book I'm currently reading, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, but again, books will go on pause. However, the next Sophisticated Discussion B track will be, as I said, History of Sexuality. Anyways, so let's talk about this book. Now, this was my introduction to Foucault, and really post-structuralism in general. And just like forewarning, that the reason I started reading Foucault, I heard a lot about him, was really so that I can eventually read Butler. And that's obviously because queer studies and theory are an important part of the content I make, and I want to be educated on that. Of course, I just want to be educated on many topics in general, but that is the reason I came to this work. And obviously, History of Sexuality is probably the work that's more important to that. But a lot of people said online that Discipline and Punish is a good introduction to Foucault's thinking, or at least his thinking at that point of his life. So I was like, okay, I'll read this. Now, what do I actually think of the work? Now, first of all, I am not a, critic of academic texts. I don't know how to discuss academic texts in serious terms. But I found it very interesting. Now, it's worth, I've said it many times, but it's worth pointing out that I come from a Marxist perspective, and Foucault is obviously not a Marxist. However, I do think that his way of looking at power as this almost all-encompassing thing, as something that, foregrounds really all human relationships and interaction, as an intriguing notion, that I think, while obviously can't be directly taken into a Marxist framework, is still worth interrogating, and gives us a lot of interesting ideas. The way he looks at the development of power in the form of institutions of punishment, perhaps I could say, carceral institutions, penal institutions, throughout time, is deeply fascinating to me. And it's actually quite particularly interesting, because for English right now, I'm reading Thomas More's Utopia, which, in that, he advocates for slavery, almost kind of the same kind of slavery that we have in modern prisons, except that they're not confined to specific penal spaces, without... What are you laughing at, honey? Okay. So it's in Utopia. The portrayal of slaves is that they're treated much like modern prisoners are treated. And I find that funny. In class, actually, the teacher brought up, wow, a lot of this stuff looks pretty good from our perspective, but then there's slaves, and it was, first of all, it was just kind of funny to note that they were slaves after stealing or whatever. Which is bad, I agree, but that is, also what prisoners do. So, I found that funny. And what I also found funny is that, really, it really, reflects that these utopian socialists, these people of the 1500s and later who were these utopians, were really kind of, if you take Foucault, what Foucault says about the developments at their face value, which... I don't know. I've heard some criticisms of Foucault's actual historiography at times. I haven't looked into that too deeply. He might be wrong on exactly how things developed. I don't know. I don't really have the context to say. But if you take what he says at his word, then it's interesting to see that the way these discourses of power developed was foreshadowed, centuries ahead of the point where we actually reached a modern penal structure, a modern carceral structure, a modern form of punishment. And as someone who's definitely very interested in punishment, in the way society categorizes, looks at, educates, classifies individuals, the way that Foucault not just looks at like literal punishments and eventually prisons, but the way that this is connected to the military, to school, not necessarily in a sense of an intersectional point of view, but in a way of how these structures come from the same discourses, from the same modes of power. It was just deeply fascinating, and definitely made me interested in reading more of Foucault's work. As I said, I'll be looking into histories of sexuality next, and if there's any other books of his that you think are must-reads or anything, then tell me in the comments. Not that I got any comments on my last video, really, but anyway, although I guess I got like one or two people who were excited for Foucault, so who knows. Anyway, see ya. I like the book. It's good. Post-structuralism seems interesting, even if I am a dirty modernist. Anyways, see ya.